Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I am Kimberly McCollin, and I would like to welcome you to our second installment of PNM TV. Today we are privileged to have Mr. Mariano Brown, who was once Minister of Trade and Industry and also Minister in the Ministry of Finance under the People's National Movement Administration. Today he's here with us to answer some of our questions, as well as to express his views on the 2010-2011 budget presented to us by the UNC-led and dominated coalition. Good evening, Mr. Brown.
Good evening.
What do you think of the energy policies upon which the budget has been based?
Well, I think rather than comment on the energy policy, because I don't think we have that enunciated in the budget speech, I could comment on the energy prices which were used on the basis for establishing the numbers which were used in the budget speech. And I think the two relevant numbers in the first instance, one, the price of oil of $65 and the price of natural gas, which is said to be the net back price at $2.75. The oil price compares with the price that was used in the last budget speech, that amounted to $55. So at $65, we are pretty close to what our realized price is. And at $2.75, which is exactly the same number that was used in the previous budget, that's pretty close. Now, I think the difficulty is that our outlook for the future is very different. We have realized prices at an average of about $65. So to use $65 is pretty close to what we are historically in a market which is volatile. On the other side, with respect to natural gas prices, $2.75 is cutting it pretty close, because the natural gas price market is one which is now subject to a degree of volatility which we did not have before. There are new players coming into the marketplace. There's a lot more supply, and by definition for them, the natural gas price is one of fiction. For us, it's a real matter. But for many of the new producers, natural gas is a byproduct. So they already make their money off of oil. So natural gas is less important to them, so they're prepared to price discount. So from that perspective, I think that the revenue numbers are ambitious and that they may be difficult to achieve.
How is the size of the budget this year compared to the previous budget?
Well, in the previous budget, the administration indicated that it would run a deficit. In fact, the maintainable number for revenue that was projected for the budget for September 2010 was predicated on a maintainable revenue position of $37 billion. In fact, we were able to realize a bit more because natural gas prices firmed a bit, as did oil prices. And as a result of which we are actually able to make a contribution to the Heritage and Stabilization Fund of just under $3 billion. So that we were able to do very well. So that we had projected a deficit of $6 billion. In fact, the actual deficit, after you take into consideration the contribution to the Heritage and Stabilization Fund, the actual budget deficit is actually quite low at $1 billion. So that the revenue position was much better than we had anticipated, and we had also done a fairly good job in maintaining or cutting our expenditure profile down to approximately $45 billion. So I think that we did very well. This year's budget number is at least 10% higher than the projected expenses from last year, and that is really going to be a real challenge in being able to, keep to those numbers given our revenue position.
So as we're on the topic of deficits, why do you think we are running a deficit?
Well, running a deficit at this stage is not a difficult one, and also very much in keeping with the philosophy which had been outlined by the PNM administration. In fact, when the PNM administration outlined its plan in November 2008 and again in February 2009, it was in the full understanding that the heady prices and the buoyant revenue position that we'd experienced before would not come to pass. We did not fully explain that we had a fairly large surplus. This is quite apart from the Heritage and Stabilization Fund. In fact, that we had run consistent budget surpluses for each of the last 5 years, so that we knew that we could afford to run deficits because we had the wherewithal to be able to pay for whatever borrowings we did in the domestic marketplace. Now, I think we've more or less come to the end of that period, and we did indicate that we'll run a budget deficit for 3 years. Our realized budget deficit in the first year was just under $6 billion. In the second year, it was $1 billion. And of course, we didn't have a third year. but the budget deficit that is now being projected by this administration is much higher. In fact, as the budget deficit which is projected is equivalent to the 2 budget deficits we ran in the first 2 years.
What does Mr. Buchanan mean by cash balances, which have been run over, which he claims have been run down after the last 24 months?
Well, that goes back to the comment I made just now. We had in fact run a number of surpluses, and a surplus effectively means that you in fact build cash and cash balances. So that we in fact at the beginning of the difficult period which we will say started in September 2008, after we presented the budget for 2008. For 2009, we in fact had a large number, or if you want, a substantial cash balance. Approximately $17 billion is the number that he uses, and that's what it was. And at the point, that's one of the reasons why we were able to keep the national debt low. And whenever we borrowed money short term, we would then be able to fund it out of the surpluses that we had. We couldn't bring those surpluses into revenue, but what we could do is use the surpluses to pay down debt, which is what we did.
So above all things, in your opinion, Mr. Brown, what do you think is the major weakness of this budget?
I think the biggest difficulty in this budget is going to be our ability to maintain the revenue profile. The total realized revenue was $41.9 billion for the year ending, or estimated revenue collection for this year is $41.9 billion. The projection for next year, for the year 2011, is $41.2 billion. It's $700 million short of what we realized. But I think even that number is very tenuous. And if you take into consideration that we've actually, the current government has actually increased the total amount of expenditure, I think that we're going to have a very tight situation, and the budget deficit, in fact, can be much larger than the $7 billion which is projected.
That's interesting. Do you think that there are any new policy directions articulated in this budget at all?
Well, they have made a number of statements, but those statements are not backed by any action or any expenditures. They are statements of policy intent. So this means that we have yet to see what they will plan to do. When you look at the actual expenditure profile, what we are seeing is a continuation of all the policies which were in fact started by the PNL. So from that perspective, I would say that the current administration has been wise. I think what it also demonstrates is that it came into office without a plan for the future. And I think that is the biggest difficulty we have moving forward. While they talk about our plan, while they talk about doing new things, what we are really going to see is that the plan which was clearly articulated and for which much work went into organizing what we will do in the future, those plans are what are going to be executed.
And how do you think that these measures that they have articulated compare, well, those that are not PNM measures, how do you think that they compare to previous measures?
Well, I'll just take two. I'll just take two. In the first instance, we've moved away. They have indicated that they're going to stop the smelter project in the southwestern peninsula. And they've come up with the alternative of, if you want, the so-called zones.
Yeah.
Right? But we have yet to see what that really means. But if we have to use, for example, Kunupia, Karani, Kuva as zones, well, one of them is already a zone.
Yeah.
And over the last 20 years, quite a few $1 billion have been spent in terms of developing Kuva,
yeah,
if only from the point of view of the petrochemical industry. The second difficulty, and in fact there's no replacement plan for the smelter. We talk about a port. Well, Trinidad already has 17 ports. We don't need another one. We talk about shipbuilding. But at a time when trade is depressed, by definition, shipbuilding will be depressed. So it's not a market that you can break into comfortably or easily, and especially insofar as we have no real experience in terms of that marketplace. The other issue that I would have, for example, is the point that is made with regard to the rapid rail project. I think that the thing that the public has to know is that the rapid rail project is not merely a rapid rail project. It was a transportation project. It was a plan which was set to look at all the various transportation opportunities or available opportunities as we move forward. And that the rapid rail was just simply one aspect. It was always understood that included a rail project at all was going to be a very expensive opposition. But at the same token, one needed to examine all the options which were available. Now, the other option that has been put on the table to develop a tunnel to go to Maracas. Well, the reality is that whilst a lot of people go to Maracas, it's if you want, a relaxing event. Whereas when we are talking about putting a transportation system, we are talking about putting a transportation system which will ease the economic burden of traffic jams, of goods getting from point A to B taking too long. That is really what the transportation system was talking about. And to talk about a tunnel to Tobago, well, that's a great idea. It's a wonderful idea. But unfortunately, it's theoretical. Not only is it theoretical, more people travel on the east-west corridor coming into Port-of-Spain, or more people travel from south to north coming into Port-of-Spain or going to south on a daily basis than people travel to Tobago in any one day. So from the point of view of a priority, whilst it is something that is laudable, while it is something that we would want to have, while it may be desirable, it is not a priority.
I understand exactly what you mean, actually. And the very big, the contentious issue right now with the Hindu Credit Union and CLICO. What do you think about the measures announced regarding these two institutions?
Well, the measures that have been announced put on the table the fact that a number of depositors are going to lose a substantial amount of money. In some instances, as much as 58% of the total monies that they've saved. When you take into consideration that a substantial number of these people are in fact retirees and people who are depending on the interest income, then those plans deviate substantially from what the last administration attempted to do. The last administration indicated that they would give a guarantee, but that they would move towards realizing assets, but not at this point in time. The purpose was to bridge the gap. And as the minister pointed out, approximately $7.3 billion have been pledged because that was the estimated shortfall. So in so doing, it was meeting what one would call the deficit or the gap, which could be paid for over time, and at the same token, giving itself sufficient time to be able to realize assets and to generate revenue. What the current plan does is realize losses. And that we're clear about, that's what's going to happen. So that means that it's going to have a tremendous effect on those persons who are least able to afford it. That's issue number one. With regard to the issue dealing with Hindu Credit Union, the previous administration always understood that we'd have to make some sort of payment towards the Hindu Credit Union depositors. The difficulty was that the books were so badly kept that we could never determine what was a depositor. And there are substantial issues that have to be bitten in that regard. So even though the current administration has announced a policy, and the policy statement may be a laudable one, there is going to be a substantial difficulty in terms of implementing it. That's the other point. And there's an additional point moving forward. The point is that having extended this policy towards Hindu Credit Union, then by definition this policy has to be extended to all credit unions that are likely to be in difficulty. And that has raises some substantial issues in terms of the legislative background, because we have no legislation which governs that at the moment. And we have no, if you want, capacity to be able to deliver that at this stage.
Thank you so very much, Mr. Mariano Brown. You know, you've not only been informative to myself, but I hope that this information can be passed on to our viewers, who I'm almost certain from this point forward will continue to listen in to PNM TV. So thank you very much and good evening.
Good. You okay?